Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Jill Savitt, the CEO of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. Today's program is about empathy and its connection to social justice. Before we begin, I want to do some quick housekeeping about upcoming programs that we have here at the center. A week from today, on October 30th, we have a program on modeling allyship that will be at noon. And you can sign up for that program, as with all our programs, at equaldignity.org. Also, our center has reopened. And even better, admissions is free in the month of October. So we hope you will come and visit us. We have really strong safety practices in place. The tickets are timed, so you'll have to order them online because we're letting a certain number of people into the building at any one time, but we really do hope you'll come visit us. As we move into our program, we need to let everyone know that the center is a nonpartisan organization and the views of our guests are their own. We have, I'm delighted to say, two experts with us today. Dr. Alisha Gaines is the Timothy Gannon Associate Professor of English at Florida State University. She's the author of Black for a Day, Fantasies of Race and Empathy, which looks at the political consequences of empathy by examining narratives of racial impersonation and questions about the idea that empathy is all white Americans can offer to make a significant difference in navigating issues of race in our society. I'm really excited to talk about that and more on that in a minute. Dr. Danielle Dickens is an assistant professor of psychology at Spelman College. Her scholarship explores how individuals from underrepresented groups both experience and cope with prejudice, especially in the workplace. Her main area of focus looks at the psychological effects of identity shifting. In other words, what happens to a person's self-perception when she or he feels compelled to alter behavior and language to fit in with a dominant social group. So there is a lot for us to explore, and here we go. Welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yep, I'm excited for the panel.
We've all heard the phrases, walk a mile in someone's shoes or see the world through someone else's eyes. And that's typically how empathy is defined. But I wanted to see if we can add to that and ask each of you for your definitions of what empathy is, and with that, how it operates in the context of racial and social justice. So Dr. Dickens, let's start with you.
Okay. Yeah, so when I think about empathy, it is the accurate sense of what someone is feeling and what they are experiencing. And that's also a major part of it is adding on the aspect of perspective taking. So you're taking the perspective of how someone else is experiencing their lived experiences as it relates to various lived experiences or identities, but then also how they are thinking about different situations. And also I want to add on Dr. Kenneth Clark, who's a psychologist, the duo, him and Mamie Clark, who created the Clark-Dow studies. He has a really unique definition about empathy, and he wrote about it in 1980 and talking about how empathy should be included in more research surrounding psychological research as it relates to race. And he says that all humans have the capacity to feel experiences of hurt, joy, among others. And so I really like about his definition is that it's not just talking about feelings of or sensing someone's feelings of hurt, but also the joy as well. Yeah. So the positive and the negative outcomes.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think I fall prey to that and think of it as bad things, that you empathize with someone only when it's bad, but not necessarily when it's good. That's helpful. Dr. Gaines?
So first off, I think I'm going to be the cynic on the panel today. So I'm just going to out myself in that.
Go for it.
But I actually take my definition of empathy from Leslie Jamison's The Empathy Exams. And she talks about it as being kind of precariously perched between both gift and invasion. I think oftentimes when people think about empathy, we lose sight of the power dynamics that are in these kind of empathetic gestures or kind of thought processes. And so I always want to kind of point to that when we're having these kinds of conversations.
Can you unpack what that invasion means?
Yeah, I mean, so when you say like to walk a mile in someone's shoes, right? There's an erasure there. There's an absence making. Like whose shoes with whose permission? I think that's what I mean by invasion of. It's often, and this will come out later when we talk about my work more specifically, but it's often from a position of power and privilege that we're able to think compassionately about, quote, the other, right? Bell Hooks calls empathy eating the other, and to name that very power dynamic in those kind of empathetic moves.
Fascinating. So there's a sense that there is overall this decline in our country of the ability to, whether it's empathy or feeling compassion for or relating to, that this is all on the decline, that from technology to individualism, a me culture to extreme polarization. So do you think that there is a deficit right now in the world of people being able to exercise those muscles? Putting aside whether it's a good thing or a bad thing to do for a minute, are people less able to do it today than they have been in the past?
So for me, as a social psychologist, I really think about the situation and an environment. And so I have to say it depends. I think on one hand, I can see how technology may prevent someone from or hinder someone's ability to engage in empathy. But on the other hand, it's unfortunate of seeing the killings and acts of violence towards Black and Brown people. I think on that hand, it's allowing people to, in some ways, they may not truly understand what it's like to experience that, but authentically, but they can somewhat think about what it would be like if this was my relative, or this was my friend, or this is what someone within my own community. So I think that it depends on the situation. So in some cases, like I said, it's hindering, but in others, I think it also may be allowing people to experience, to a certain extent, what Black and Brown people have been feeling for so long.
Yeah. Dr. Gaines, if not empathy, what? So I think I've heard a lot lately that to bridge the racial divide, let's just stick with that for a second, that we need more empathy, that people need to cultivate empathy. They need to really think about, as Dr. Dickens just said, what that experience is like for somebody, and try and put it on a more human, personal level to really think deeply about it. So maybe that is true. Are there other things that we also need to be employing to bridge that divide? If empathy it's not the answer or the only one, what other kinds of tools are there?
Right. So this is right on. So I think empathy can be a starting place. I think the problem is with when we have these conversations and empathy is just it. Like, oh, I've imagined if George Floyd was my son, that he cried out for me as his mom. And I'm saying that having never seen that video and I never want to see that 8-minute and 46-second video. I don't need to see that video. I've seen enough Black death to last many lifetimes. But I think, so empathy can be that starting place of, oh my gosh, what if that was my child? And then there needs to be, I think, some kind of risk involved. So empathy plus, and I've been thinking about this since I wrote the first book. So empathy is not enough. I'm convinced of that. So empathy plus what? And I believe that plus is risk. It is and real risk, like not the performative kind of allyship that we're seeing on Facebook and Twitter, not just hashtags. That is not risky, but actually using one's privilege in the service of addressing systemic and institutionalized racism. That gets us to, bridge these racial divides, not just clutching our pearls and feeling very sad after watching a video of someone being murdered in front of his coworkers as they watched on camera.
And so the risk is something like putting something on the line at work, for instance.
Absolutely. It's the willingness to lose something. It's the willingness to have conversations with the family members in your life who are still not understanding what's going on. It has to be. I always tell my students that when they go off for Thanksgiving break, like, all right, I want my white students to ruin your family Thanksgiving, to like have those conversations to make it awkward and make it uncomfortable, and then suffer those very consequences. There must be something that's put on the line. Black folks and brown folks are always on the line. We need white folks to be on the line with us as well.
Yeah, Dr. Dickens. So there is research that says that there is a racial empathy gap, that that people feel less empathy for someone of a different race. And there are studies that show this, for instance, around pain, that, you could see in studies, it's white skin getting penetrated by a needle versus black skin getting penetrated by a needle. People have a stronger reaction to the white skin and less to the black skin. Do we see that in practice? How does that operate in the world? What is the racial empathy gap, that not in a study, but in practice?
Yeah, I think we can think about it in so many different situations. And one immediate one that comes to mind when we think about the Black women's maternal health and mortality rates, in terms of Black women have consistently shared that they're in pain and that something in their body is not feeling right and they're still not being heard. And also, I recently saw a story about a Black woman who died from COVID-19, and similar situation. She kept going to the doctor in the hospital saying like something is not right, and they just kept sending her home. So I think those are the two that come to mind when we think about the intersection of race and gender, of how it's that idea of that, and particularly Black women can take pain, and that we're strong Black women, and that we can handle all these different oppressions that we're experiencing.
I think it's so important because in this discussion of empathy, because I think people think of empathy as a one-on-one kind of thing and not an institutional thing, but it's human beings who make up the healthcare system. And so it has these individual, but then group dynamic consequences on people. And so I think, is that part of the racial empathy gap, is the effect of those things on groups of people?
Right, exactly, right. Because sometimes it feels like it's this individual type of racism or gendered racism. But then that can then impact the institutional racism and cultural racism.
Right. So I believe your research looks at this in the workplace. So that's an area of your focus. Can you talk about how it plays out in the workplace?
Yeah, so we think about even now, a lot of companies are focusing on using, buzzwords like diversity and inclusion. And so when we think about diversity, it's all about the awareness of cultural differences. But then to take it a step further, thinking about this conversation of empathy, is that the inclusion piece is creating spaces where people that belong to different groups, particularly different marginalized groups, feel welcome and have a sense of belonging. And so when we think about empathy as it relates to that, on the flip side of it, when people who lack empathy, they may say things like, if someone, were to come forward and say that they experienced some type of discrimination, you may hear, for instance, a person of color, a white person saying, well, I haven't experienced that, so it must not be happening. So it's discounting their countless experiences of discrimination, particularly within the workplace. And then as a result, as it relates to my research, that causes people, particularly people of color, to engage in these type of coping strategies. And one of them I look at is identity shifting, altering the way that you talk and behave to fit in or to accommodate others or to mitigate the negative outcomes associated with discrimination. So the idea of, I'm going to wear my hair straight instead of in its natural state, to avoid experiencing of discrimination, but we find that that is associated with negative psychological outcomes. So I think it's important to have this sense of empathy when we're thinking about diversity and inclusion, but then adding on the advocacy piece, the action piece that Dr. Gaines is speaking to about, right? We can't just say, like she mentioned, it's just the first step, but it really has to be this action and this sustained action that then becomes, hopefully, the goal is that it becomes built into the culture.
Right. So, Dr. Gaines, I want to turn to your research. So, you have a book that focuses on historical examples of racial impersonation. Can you tell us what that's about, who has done this, and how it's related to the conversation of empathy and social justice?
Sure. So my book is called Black for a Day, White Fantasies of Race and Empathy. And it basically traces a genealogy of mostly who actually become Black temporarily, and in most cases, terrible books about
I'm sorry,
their
Dr. Gaines,
experiences.
you went out for a minute. So we missed, I just want to make sure everyone hears this. The book focuses on people who, was it white people who?
Yes, mostly white liberals who become Black. I'm using all the quotes here, for Black, become Black under the alibi, the kind of spurious alibi of cross-racial empathy. So most folks can think about John Howard Griffin's Black Like Me, where he literally changes the color of his skin, goes down south to experience racism and in the early 60s. But there is a kind of genealogy of people who did this kind of what I call empathetic racial impersonation. Starting with
how many? Just so
yeah, so starting with Ray Sprigle, he was a journalist in the 40s from Pittsburgh, and he thought it would get him a second Pulitzer Prize if he would pretend to be a Black man named James Crawford, goes down south, writes a whole series of articles, front page, and also a book that flopped. John Howard Griffin does the same thing in the 60s. Grace Halsell was the woman who does the same thing, but this time she goes to Harlem as a Black woman first, and then decides these aren't really authentically Black people. They're too kind of white aspirational for her. So she thinks, I'm gonna go find real Black people, and that means Mississippi. So she goes down to Mississippi as a Black woman. She works as a domestic. And then I talk about a very bizarre reality TV show from 2006 called Black White. And it's two families, a white family who they kind of with Hollywood prosthetics and makeup get transformed into a Black family. Then a Black family under the same kind of transformation gets transformed into a white family. They live in a house like Real World style. It is a terrible TV show. I do not recommend. Co-produced by Ice Cube, actually. So the fact that he's in the news right now for what he's doing is not surprising to me in the least bit. And then the book ends with who I call the last soul sister, which is the viral story of Rachel Dolezal in 2015, who did not, quote, become Black temporarily. She still insists that she's Black even today after the scandal.
Right, and then there's another professor at American University, like George Washington, one of those, a DC school, who just did the same thing. Did their accounts, what did they say they learned?
Oh, they said so for John Howard Griffin, for Grace Halsell, for Ray Sprigle, they all said after the weeks that they were Black, that they now know what it means to be Black. Always the Blackness was over-associated with suffering, with pain, with trauma, with racial terror. There's no joy. There's no being a person. They usually trafficked in the most racist stereotypes about Black people, even though they supposedly experience Blackness. And so in kind of Grace Halsell's book is called Soul Sister. It came out in 1969. really in the middle of the Black Power movement. Do we need a white woman pretending to be Black? Absolutely not. But her conclusion about Black womanhood is that it is nothing but pain and suffering. And she kind of absconds back into whiteness after, in the narrative, she is nearly sexually assaulted by a white man as she was working as a Black domestic in a family home. And then she says, I can't do this anymore, and goes back to being a white lady.
Yeah, it sounds like part of it, I'm pulling this from what you've just said, was for personal gain to do this.
Absolutely. I mean, Ray Sprigle, it was for a career. I mean, he wanted another Pulitzer Prize. Grace Halsell actually said, I need this experience, as if it was an adventure to her. And I'll say with Grace Halsell, she didn't just become Black. She kind of made a career out of this. She was a Navajo woman after this. She also pretended to be an undocumented Mexican migrant worker after this. So this was, she was like collecting experiences of identity, is how I think about her.
Now, Dr. Dickens, I'll turn it over to you. When you hear that, do you hear in today's empathy that people are feeling, and after the murder of George Floyd, and issues are very much on the surface right now, this kind of performative aspect of empathy, is that something we're seeing right now? Is it something we should worry about? Because I think people who are, everything is ginned up, and we've talked about performative, that people are doing this for how it makes them look rather than what they can do to advance things. Do you feel that that's an aspect of what's going on today?
I do. I think that, I'm curious to see how things will look over time with the election results, but it does feel like it is performative for some. And I think what you were saying, I'm really interested in reading your book.
Yeah.
And what you're saying, it made me think about people's intentions, right? And it seemed like all that was for personal gain. So when we think about empathy, we have to think about what are people's intentions. Now, even though people can have good intentions, but it could still have a negative impact, but really thinking about, are there intentions to have this sense of empathy for the greater good, for the greater cause. So I think that it does seem to be that there is this performative piece, but I also want to acknowledge that, just even think about some of my experiences, going to graduate school, being at a predominantly white institution, and then now being at Spelman, just over the past couple of years or so, just seeing that the shift and change of more companies coming forward, providing funding to historically Black colleges, like that's something that it's a move. But also I think that, people have pushed people to do that and made demands through the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements of like, this is like, we're tired, we're fed up, that we need to see actual change. So I'm just really curious to see about how long this is going to last. And is it going to make sustained changes over time?
Do you have thoughts about how we can ensure it will last?
That's a big question. I mean, when we think about institutional types of oppression, it impacts so many different facets, and one of them is policies, right? So we'll see we'll see what the results of the elections, at the state and the presidential level. But definitely policies, right? Policies have to change. But then even some people may feel like if the policies change, is it going to be in a way that is going to effectively impact Black and brown people in the US? But I think that could be a start. I think also, like the conversation that we're having, it has to be at the institutional, but then also has to be at the individual level, because this is what we're experiencing sometimes on a day-to-day basis within these certain types of institutions, and institutions broadly, but then also particularly within different workplaces. But we have to think about how this impacts hiring, right, and pay inequities. So I think it's so many facets, but it has to start with, I think, making these changes as it relates to policies.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I also have a critique of empathy. Dr. Gaines said it very powerfully. I've always thought of it is that empathy is an interpersonal thing, but it must be tied to advocacy. that empathy and advocacy, you've even taken it to, you have to think about it as giving something up, taking a risk yourself in doing that advocacy. So that's kind of pushed the envelope for me in thinking of that. I agree that it has to be, the empathy has to lead to some sort of structural change. Dr. Gaines, can you tie those things together? How can empathy be used in the service of empathy plus plus?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can tie them together. I mean, thinking about empathy plus risk, I mean, we're not going to get to, and I'm not working towards just diversity and inclusion, but Black liberation. So we're not going to get to this policy is not going to change without our agitation and resistance. They don't just hand out liberties in this country. We have to demand them. We have to require them and mandate them and hold people to the fire. Through our agitation and resistance, then we get to things like advocacy and policy change making. So I think, you know, like I said, empathy is just the very, very first start in a long kind of road to getting us to liberation.
Yeah, I want to start to tell people listening to, if you've got questions, please put them in the chat. We'll be getting to them, but just a heads up. So when we turn to that moment, your questions will be in there. I think I want to turn to, we live in such a polarized country right now that it's hard for people to have civil conversations. Empathy almost feels some days like, wow, that would be a real gift to have people think more empathetically or empathically about others. So to be responsibly empathetic, what are some guidances you would give people about how to approach their empathy so it isn't intrusive? So it does get them on the road to empathy plus, that it's not just about individuals. What we'll start with you, Dr. Dickens. What is your advice on that front?
First, it has to start off with doing the self-work. And what that looks like is self-awareness, self-examination, checking one's privilege, checking one's own biases, and just explicit, right? Because we know that with one's implicit biases, they show up in different ways and automatically and unconsciously. But I think that's a start in terms of one becoming more aware of their identities, their privilege, reading. And sometimes people may feel like, well, I don't know about this. I don't know where to start. Well, now it's like we have Google and all these resources and books that is so easy to have access to. And especially over the period of time of the protests that's still happening, is that some of these resources are free. So now it's not an excuse. So I think that's a start of the self-awareness, checking one's privilege, checking one's own biases, and also thinking about, we're talking about one's racial identities. There's so many different, think about one's identity development, right? And so Helms created the white racial identity model. And it kind of breaks down where people, white people are as it relates to their identity so that they can get to this type of anti-racist action and ideology. But it breaks it down. So I think that can be a start of researching that model and to see where do you fall and what are the actions you're going to take to get through those stages of the white racial identity model. So I think that's a start.
Yeah.
I just want to say, I'm sorry, I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Dickens, for saying, like, it's no longer an excuse to say that you don't know what you, like, it's unacceptable to say, I have no idea where to start. Ida B. Wells was telling white people what to do in 1895 at the end of the Red Record. Like, this is not an excuse, and Google is free still. Yeah. So thank you for saying that.
Did you want to add to that, Dr. Gaines, about what empathy tips, guidance on expressing empathy in a way that it's going to move the project forward?
Yes, I guess my first bit of guidance would be, don't rest us at the feet of Black and brown folks. This is not our work to instruct any on this, even though we're instructing on it right now, but that's a different story. But that don't have us do all of the emotional labor of walking white folks, well-intentioned they may be, and having us do that. It is, we have there are tools, there are resources, like Dr. Dickens says, that they are free. We have the internet. I know that after George Floyd's murder, white folks gathered together and y'all joined a giant worldwide book club, right? The white fragility was on the book club list. How to be an anti-racist was on the book club list. Okay, so I don't know if the book club is still going on, but now continue to read. I'm reading Black folks would be fantastic, and also start to act.
I've put up in the chat something called Civic Dinners. It's a partnership that we're doing with a group called Civic Dinners and Equitable Dinners and Coca-Cola. And it's happening tonight, and there's a whole schedule of them. And it takes up issues about racial equity, and it breaks people into, there's a beginning expert who talks about it, and then people get into smaller groups that are racially diverse. And it gives people an opportunity to hear personal stories, to ask questions of white people, of Black people, and to try and because I think one of the problems is that we still live in a very segregated society. And the workplace is one of the places where Black and white people interact. Sometimes it's not happening in our neighborhoods, in our schools. And so there is this wall that exists, a structural, and it exists for a bunch of reasons, that people aren't able to have personal interactions. And so these civic dinners are an opportunity for people who find themselves in that situation to start to do that. So in terms of allyship, we've talked about that. We've referred to it, but not named it as allyship. Are there ways that to approach allyship that are not about empathy, that are about empathy, but that take it to the next level? I mean, perhaps we've covered this ground in what you've already said, but that concept of allyship, how do you feel about that in terms of empathy? Is that Dr. Dickens?
Yeah, so I think we talked about it or touched on it, but just to add to the conversation, I would say so again, starting off with doing self-work, but also it may look like amplifying the voices of the marginalized and oppressed. And so and Dr. Gaines, you touched on it too, but if you're sharing something on social media, why don't you share somebody of an article of someone that's Black or brown, right? To really amplify their voices about what they're experiencing. And then also when we think about in the workplace as well, if you're in the workplace and you notice that a person that belongs to a marginalized group, that they keep saying a comment or something and they're being ignored or overlooked, then acknowledge that, right? And mention that, well, so-and-so was trying to say this, or so. I think that's just a small way, but amplifying the voices. And like I say, if you see something, speak on it. But I think in order to get to that point, you have to do a lot of the work in order to know what that looks like, instead of it coming across as you are speaking on behalf of people of color. So you have to do the work to understand what that means and what that looks like so that you don't do it.
Right. So having empathized, don't speak with authority. Mm-hmm. Amplify, always point to people who have experienced things firsthand, mm-hmm. to be the tellers of their own story. Mm-hmm. That's helpful. I just wanted to dive a little more deeply into your research, Dr. Dickens, about this idea of identity shifting and how that affects people's perception of themselves. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so I started doing this research from my own experience of, I was more consciously aware of it. I think I probably have done it before, but I was consciously aware of it when I went to graduate school in Colorado. And being in a department where I was like one of two Black women among empathy, graduate students, faculty, and staff. And I found myself engaging in it. And so I did some research and found the term, and I wanted to understand more about it, and particularly looking at it among Black women that have this double jeopardy, this is of experiencing racism and sexism among other forms of oppression. And so with the research, really, I do research on both the benefits and the cost of it, but really focusing on the cost and how some people do engage across different groups, engage in identity shifting to advance professionally and socially within different spaces. But I really focus on the cost of not being able to be your authentic self, the cost of being the token or being tokenized within the workplace. And we know that there's countless research that suggests that when people are able to be their authentic self in the workplace, that can lead to more productivity and more satisfaction, job satisfaction. And so a lot of my research suggests, and I'm starting to do more research of looking at it, particularly among Black women in STEM, and how some of the negative psychological outcomes associated with it related to anxiety and depression. And the hope is that it's getting to the point where spaces are more inclusive so that people do not have to engage in identity shifting. And also recognizing that some people don't shift. Some people resist and say, even though I don't maybe want to experience this type of discrimination, I'm still going to be who I am. But I think also, and I looked at it among early career Black women. And so sometimes it feels like, okay, if I'm in my early career, I'm still trying to establish myself, there may be a little bit more pressure or feelings of pressure to, do I have to engage in shifting so I can get to where I want to be career-wise? And then I'm going to be more of my authentic self. So I look at it particularly among early career Black women because of that notion of maybe feeling pressure to, maybe I have to do this to get to where I want to be, but then also recognizing some people don't shift at all.
That's so interesting. We have a question from one of our listeners, viewers. How is empathy measured? How do you know when you've achieved it? Who gets to say whether or not one has achieved empathy? Is it a destination or a continuous journey throughout life? Start with you, Dr. Gaines.
That is a really wonderful question. Thank you to whoever sent it. And I'm not sure I have a definitive answer to that. The end of the question feels like a bit of an answer as a continuous journey. It's not like check. I understand what it means for everybody. I think that's not how this works. But a continuous process of learning and relearning what it means to show up for each other, even when that seems risky or threatening or makes you vulnerable or precarious. I don't think that privilege is something you can just undo and unlearn. It's a constant practice, would be my stab at an answer to that very good question.
Yeah, Dr. Dickens, do you want to take a stab at how is empathy measured? How do you know when you've achieved it?
I'll try. So in terms of how empathy is measured, I mean, if you're looking at it from a research perspective, there are established scales and questionnaires that measure empathy. Now, individual, and that could be a start. In terms of how do you know when you achieved it, that's difficult. But I think it, as Dr. Gaines mentioned, it really focuses on one's actions. Right? And then, as you mentioned too, that it has to be this continuous process of relearning, and I think for some unlearning certain things. Because I think one of the things that can impact one's level of empathy is the idea of groupthink. So thinking in a way or making decisions that are consistent with how their group thinks. And especially if people think about themselves in terms of their group self relative to their individual self, they're going to have to unlearn all that in terms of how their group thinks. So it is a continuous process. And it's hard to know like when it's achieved, but it has to me, it has to look at patterns, someone's patterns in their actions and their behaviors as it relates to advocacy.
I think that's really helpful that I think I'll take a stab that you can know when you've achieved it when you feel compelled to do something about it. So just the feeling of saying, wow, these children have been separated from their parents at the border and it's a horrific thing. And that's getting there is one thing, but it's so horrific. I can't rest until I contact a leader, write about this on my social, till I tell other people about it, till I galvanize, till I start to, and then I think Dr. Gaines gives us a high bar till you take some sort of personal risk to make sure that something's going to happen. So it's a really interesting question. And I would agree that yes, you're never done with it. It starts to be a way of life for you. We have another question. How can I move beyond my fear of speaking up after being chastised and criticized when I have spoken up before? Dr. Gaines, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. So that's also another good question. And I am always going to think about that question through the Lord. And when I say the Lord, I mean Audre Lorde, not Jesus. So in A Litany for Survival, she says, it is better to speak knowing we were never meant to survive. That poem is a litany for not just Black folks, but the folks who live at the intersection of BIPOC identity and queerness. And so speaking up, even when you've been chastised, even if your voice is trembling, because silence saves no one. And in this moment is not just complicity, but violence. So even though it's scary and your voice is trembling, speak up. It is better to speak knowing we were never meant to survive.
Do you have an opinion on speaking up using honey versus vinegar? It's, if you were talking about confronting people who are on an opposite political view or come from a completely different worldview and getting through to such people. Do you have experience with one-on-one or face-to-face with people who just totally disagree? What works in persuading them? Or is persuasion not the goal?
Is this question towards me?
Yeah, Dr. Gaines.
Yeah, I mean, so I teach Black studies at a predominantly white institution. So yes, I'm going to be confronting people who disagree with me. They either voice their opinions in my classroom or they just trash me on my student evaluations at the end of the semester. That's fine. I don't think it's an either or. I think it depends on personality. I think it depends on who you're talking to. I think it depends on a lot of things. That there is time to speak softly and walk someone through something. But there are also times when that is not an option. Like I'm not going to speak with honey in my mouth when I demand that my life matters, because mattering is not a high bar. They're actually really low to say that we actually matter, to say that I'm a human being, please don't kill us. So in that case, I'm not going to speak sweetly about that. I'm going to take to the streets and insist that my life matters and the people that look like me matter.
Dr. Dickens, do you have advice on how someone can move beyond fear of speaking up, especially when they've spoken up and been criticized or chastised?
I mean, I agree everything that Dr. Gaines mentioned, and it really depends on a lot of different factors. When I read the question, I was thinking about, what is this related to? Is it related to race? Is this a white person asking the question? Is this a person of color? I think it just depends on a lot of those factors. And like you said, your personality, right? And I just think about if you are a person of color and you're speaking up chastised, but you know that you need to keep a job, then you're going to have to think more strategically about how you speak. You can speak up, but you have to think more strategically about it. So I think that you do have to kind of get past that fear, but also recognizing the space that you're in. And if you need this job, or whatever the case may be, if that's what you value at that moment, then being more strategic about how you speak up. And it doesn't have to be more so honey, but just kind of in between, but you're just being more strategic about who you like, what you say and how you say it, but getting the same message across.
Dr. Dickens, I just want to say that's a really good point, and this is where the allies come in, right? So this is a person of color, a Black person, a brown person who needs to keep that job. Then where are the white folks who can speak with, without fear of the same kinds of consequences, without the fear of the same kind of vulnerabilities? So that's where allies are desperately needed.
Excellent. Another question: if a person presents in their career office as aesthetically Eurocentric, what ways would you suggest if that person begins to present their cultural awareness as an African American? I guess that is for Dr. Dickens to start.
Yeah, so what I would suggest is really thinking about what is your authentic professional self looks like. And I think that for some people, they are able to, as a Black person of color, they're able to be their authentic self within any given space. But for some, it's that we have to think about what does our authentic self look like within the professional setting. Like there's a lot of research on professional identity, but one that is authentic. And so I would say for that person is just to be their authentic self and whatever that looks like, and not to feel pressure to have to bring up their culture within even given space, because some people, in a sense of that, in some ways it's a balance, because some certain things as it relates to your culture, you want to hold that in. You don't have to share that with people at work. But as an example, it's just being like, for instance, just being comfortable. If you're able, if you're listening to music, listen to the type of music that you want to listen to, and don't be afraid if you like ratchet music and you want to listen to that at work. Like, just be comfortable with, because when we think about what it means to have this African American or Black identity, that looks different. Like Blackness looks different for people. So I think I would encourage that person to think about what does that mean to you, and then think about what would you be willing to share, and don't feel pressure that you have to share all of your Blackness within the workplace. So thinking about particularly, like I said, what is it that you want to share, what's authentic to you, and that can be a start.
Dr. Gaines, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, I think Dr. Dickens nailed that. Yeah.
She did. Does any research, there's another question, does any research suggest that there is a difference in effectiveness of addressing topics of privilege or understanding social justice when whites address with whites versus when a person of color addresses with a white person? Dr. Gaines, let's start with you.
I'm sorry, I'm rereading the question because you went out for me a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. I'm not sure about the research piece. Dr. Dickens might know more about this than I do on the research aspect of this.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of it. There is some, when we think about in-group versus out-group, I mean, there is some research that points to, as you were saying, Dr. Gaines, too, it relates to the allyship. So being a white ally, how that can have an impact in addressing other white people. But I think it depends on, I really think it depends on certain factors in terms of that. Of course, I think there is some research that points to, people of color affecting and having an effect on change when addressing a white person. But I think it really depends on the level of interaction, right? So there's some research in the psychology on like the contact hypothesis. So having these like meaningful interactions with people across different racial groups, that can actually increase one's level of empathy and lower someone's racial prejudice. So in some ways, if you are having meaningful interactions, if you're engaging in some type of cooperative task, then that can actually lower people's racial prejudice attitudes.
Interesting. I think that I've seen research, it's more in the terms of advocacy, that sometimes a trusted messenger by the person, this is usually a target of advocacy, having a trusted messenger approach is more effective because it's like breadcrumbs that you have to sometimes lead people along. I don't know what the name of the research is, but trusted messenger as an approach in advocacy is something that there is research on. And I think all of this depends on the context, of course. Who are the people? What are you trying to do with them? What is their background? All of that. I'm going to juggle to, there are questions also in the chat. So what's the best approach for reaching family and friends who are resistant to learning and understanding and who won't seek out books and articles on their own without scaring them away so much that they dig their heels in even more? Advice on that. Start with you, Dr. Dickens.
So I would say that, I always say that, but it depends. But I think that, as Dr. Gaines mentioned, it is a risk. And thinking about, not only are we thinking about white people having these conversations within their own community, but when we're thinking about people of color, and think about what does different types of discrimination look like within our own community. Like sometimes we have to have these difficult types of difficult types of discussions as well. And I think that it depends on how close you are with that individual. So I think that can impact it, that you can be you may feel more comfortable being a little bit more blunt, like this is what it is. Where if you maybe tried that with a certain relative, they're going to shut down and it's not going to be helpful anyways. So I think it's like understanding, for me, how that person is. If you have a closer relationship with them, I think you can be a little bit more blunt. But if you don't, I think that because you don't want them to shut down, and you know this already, and sometimes it can be difficult to change people's attitudes. But I think that sharing information, even in my classes at Spelman, videos that I show, like students always say like, oh, I talked about this with a parent, or I shared this on social media, or I talked this about friends. Like that can be a start of just sharing it. Maybe they may ignore the first message that you send, but if you keep doing that, at some point they're going to read it. But I think you have to be mindful of your approach, depending upon, to me, your level of closeness with them. Because if they shut down, which we see that some people do on social media, it's not gonna, their attitudes and perspectives are not gonna change.
And it is true, there might be some people that you have to make a decision, how much energy am I going to put into this? Exactly. How can I use my energy most effectively and keep my own motivation for doing this work? It might be just a problem for another day that you come back to them again later. Dr. Gaines, did you want to add anything on that front?
I was going to add something very similar to what you just said, Jill, where I was thinking as Dr. Dickens was talking, oh, she's nicer than me. Because okay, it's 2020. There are multiple pandemics going on, a racial one as well as a global health crisis, and we all have limited capacity. And I'm not going to talk till I'm blue in the face to someone who is going to just be completely resistant. I'm also not afraid to cut people who I thought were friends, cut people who I thought were family. I'm queer, so I believe that you choose your family. I choose my family, and I'm very precious in how I choose my friends. And so I don't count friends where I have to, insist over and over and over again that George Floyd should be alive right now. Those are not conversations I am willing to have.
So we have another question. Would you put a gender lens on this? And we have, to some degree, are women more naturally empathetic than, question mark, are women more naturally empathetic? How do they get over their natural aversion to risk to act with sisterhood toward others? Dr. Dickens, you want to take that one?
Sure. I think it depends on people's approach. And I take more of a social cultural approach when thinking about this question, are women more naturally empathetic? And I think that it is certain environments that in some ways create these spaces where, or for instance, we think about, when children are brought up, where a lot of the parents tend to have more open conversations with their daughters. And in some ways, in that way, that can impact women's level of being empathetic. Right? So I think it depends on how someone is brought up, and a lot of different cultural factors that can impact that. So I wouldn't say that women are naturally, for me, I wouldn't say that. I think it depends. It's a cultural dynamic that impacts that. But how do they get over the natural aversion to risk, their access to their choice of risk? I would say that you really have to be your authentic self, because that you have to be your authentic self, but you also have to put yourself first and forward. And Dr. Dickens mentioned of being intentional about who you're letting into your space, and also if you're engaging in a certain conversation or situation, if that is in some ways impacting your own mental health and mental space, and that's regardless of one's gender identity. So I think that you have to, one, know who you are, and also know your authentic self. And of course, that's going to change over time, but whatever approach kind of works best for you. In terms of, if you feel like you are an empathetic person, that's okay, but still, how are you going to navigate these different spaces so that you're still putting your self-care first?
Right, thank you. I'm sorry, the time went fast and I just realized we are now out of time. Thank you both, Dr. Dickens and Dr. Gaines, for your comments. I hope we said your books at the beginning. I don't know if you both would mind typing them into the chat so people can look them up. Fascinating. I will look at this racial impersonation. I'm going to end with, allow Maya Angelou to have the last word. She said, "I think we all have empathy. We may not have enough courage to display it." And I think that's interesting in terms of what it would really mean to express empathy, as we've discussed in this conversation. I think maybe people came to this thinking empathy is the solution. And I think there's a powerful case to be made, not just. It's empathy and. So thank you both for joining us. If you'd like to join other programs on the Campaign for Equal Dignity, go to equaldignity.org. Please come and visit us at the center. We are now open, but be sure to sign up for tickets. I want to thank Carol Lamott for organizing this show, and we'll see you next week. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.